welcome to the All the Grief podcast. We're your host. I'm Rebecca Luttrell.
And I'm Andrea Giron-Mathern.
This will be our weekly podcast for everyone touched by grief, which we assume is all the humans.
It will be hosted by Rebecca and myself. Rebecca is a therapist and I am not. But it's sort of our journey about how our friendship deepened when my father passed, and then we were connected by each having experienced the loss of our fathers. And so we kind of wanted to start talking about grief and bringing some of our conversations to a broader audience. And so we're bringing grief to light and exploring all the ways that we as all the humans experience it.
I mean, when we say all the grief, we mean all the grief, and exploring in our episodes a wide range of the ways grief enters our life. Things like COVID grief or any kind of natural disaster grief, events that happen in our world, climate grief, and then sometimes really personal grief, like the loss of a parent, the loss of a child. We'll explore books on grief, and we'll invite guests over time that are specific to the topics we're looking at, and even helping support people in grief when you haven't experienced a specific grief. We feel like that's probably going to be in our first group of episodes because it feels really important to have a place to point people when you're in grief and you need support and they just don't get it. But we're going to invite folks to join us as we're building community to even reach out and share their stories. So as our listeners, we'll be inviting over time more of your stories to be a part of this podcast.
Fantastic. So we thought that we would just share exactly what Rebecca said, just a little bit of our journey and how we got here. So Rebecca, how did you end up on this podcast with me?
So most of my life, I had been the emotional support for people in my life. Family, friends. So it led me to an undergraduate degree in psychology. And I graduated knowing there was not much I could do without graduate school. And I just knew too many therapists and they seemed not thrilled with their profession. And I thought, let me explore what else there is to do in the world. So I became a graphic designer, spent a solid number of years in the creative realm, but had a series of back-to-back tragedies in my early 30s that thrust me straight into my own grief, into the territory of grief. I'm sure I'm going to share more about those in time, but for now, I'll just say that what I learned in those tragedies, which spanned about a year and a half, was my own capacity to sit with pain. And that brought me back into a desire to be a therapist from a different place. So not so much, oh, let me help everyone not be in pain, but knowing I could actually sit with pain. So a lot of things happened that led me towards finding Naropa. So I moved to Colorado from Florida. I got my master's in psychotherapy, and I still didn't really realize I wanted to work with grief specifically. I just felt clear I wanted to work with pain. So I worked at different agencies, sort of trying to find my niche. But what was interesting was I kept finding myself in territory adjacent to grief. For example, I was working with a client with an eating disorder, and suddenly she's in profound grief over the unexpected death of a friend. And then I'm working with a child who's struggling with anxiety, and he has a close family member dies. And now we're focusing on grief. There was a young girl who came to me for just general support, but then what we were actually working on was a really huge grief loss from losing her dog. And so I just kept touching into grief in all these different ways. And at this time, I was also working part-time at Naropa as someone who was guiding graduate students through the process of writing and presenting their master's papers. And one of the students I was working with, her whole presentation was on grief. So she was referencing all these books. I mean, the writing of her paper and her own grief in her life. And just everything about it resonated so strongly with me. I'm not just editing her paper at this point. I am buying every book on her reference list, and I'm just immersed in reading and soaking in everything I can about grief. And so she shared about a grief ceremony she attended, and I found myself there within a few months. It was beautiful. So this ceremony was led by someone trained by Subonfu Some, who, with her husband Malidoma, brought their native Dagara tribes grief rituals to the US. And they trained people in leading these grief rituals because they saw that we were a culture sort of devoid devoid of ritual and devoid of ways to hold our grief. And so I'm at this ceremony. We start circle in the beginning, like most ceremonies in Boulder, Colorado. And we're sharing what brought us here. And I'm just listening to story after story of intense grief. And I mean, the grief in the room was palpable. There was a lot of acute grief. And I just started to feel this like inner critic bubbling up inside of me that said, my grief is so far away. I shouldn't be here. My dad died 6 years ago. I'm an imposter. That was coming up. And I knew I had unshed tears, but I also wasn't sure I could even access it. So it was like, oh, it's just not here right now. And I don't know if I should be here. And part of me just wanted to be like, when it was my turn to share, to say, I'm sorry, I think my grief isn't here, and just leave. But that would have been a bold move. So I just stayed. And I knew that part of the ceremony included supporting people who were grieving. So I was like, well, at the very least, I'll just be here as support. And if it's not up, it's not up. And that's okay. So the ceremony starts with drumming, and you're singing. You learn a chant, a very simple chant that is in the Dagara language. There are 3 altars, and as you feel called to move to any of the altars, you move up. But the primary one is the grief altar. So if you're starting to feel grief, you move up to the grief altar. And I think it's just like a black cloth and a bowl of salt water representing like holding our tears, and there are just cushions around. And so this first woman moves up, and then what we're instructed to do as part of the community that's drumming and chanting, I think they called it a village. When you feel moved, someone needs to sit behind the person grieving. You don't make contact, you don't touch them, but you sit behind them, and you're just sort of, you have their back. You're holding space behind them. And then if suddenly you feel grief welling up in you, you move aside, and you trust someone's going to move in behind you. So it's like this really elegant, beautiful, I mean, I want to say symphony, like this natural way that everyone's moving together and attuned to each other and attuned to what they need. And this woman goes up, she's crying. I go to sit behind her, stoically holding my seat, holding space for her. And she's wailing. And a few minutes into her wailing, I just feel grief bubbling up in me. I don't even know what, I don't remember her story or her share, but I could just feel how intense the grief was. And it was calling something in me. So I move away from her to the grief space next to her. I start to cry. I know I can feel the presence, like someone's come behind me. There's someone sitting behind her. Now she's okay. I'm being held. I never saw the person sitting behind me, but I could feel their presence. I still can when I think about it. It was really powerful. So I'm crying again. I diminish my own experience. I say, I'm barely crying. I should probably wrap this up and make space for somebody else. So there's all this judgment, criticism, comparison.
Yeah.
You don't have this grief that other people have. You only have a little bit of grief. They really need to be here. You're taking up space, all that shit. But then there's this other, much wiser voice in me repeating the words, stay with it, trust this. Trust this. And so I'm staying with it, and I cry, assuming it's just been a few tears. I sit up and discover my face is drenched. It's just like drenched in tears. And it's in that moment that I realize I have so much ungrieved grief. And this is really important work. And then you move from that space to this cleansing altar that has water that you can kind of splash on your face. And there's like all these nature items. And you just sort of sit there for a moment until I think basically, you're regulated. But what I notice is I feel significantly lighter. And I had read at this point about how grief and vitality are intertwined, grief and joy are intertwined, but now I was having an embodied experience of it, like a dam had broken and I had released so much trapped grief. And now I just felt reverence and love for being alive that I hadn't experienced in quite some time, like since the time that my dad died. And so that's kind of when I became a student of grief. And I had read Francis Weller's work, and he calls working with grief soul activism. So I sort of was this self-described soul activist. I started participating as a participant in grief circles at the Grief Support Network in Boulder. And I ended up training in their grief yoga program. I was signing up for every class I could find on grief, learning everything possible, and suddenly felt really clear about my path, which is part of why we're here. The world is so afraid of grief, and it started to feel really important for me personally to offer space for people in grief. And I think that grieving in community is one of the most powerful things we can do. And I
Mm.
know that from a lived experience. So I, started to offer groups where we would get a chance to just witness each other in our grief, where no one's trying to fix anyone, as this powerful medicine. And there's nothing to fix in grief. And I think that's such a different model than the part of me that was helpful
Mm.
growing up and helpful as an undergrad therapist, and was kind of unlearning trying to be helpful as I was going through grad school. But there was still this idea that someone's coming to you and saying, oh, I don't want this anymore. And you're offering some version of a way out. And with grief, you actually are making space for a way in. And
Mm.
it just was so different. So that's my niche. And that's what I'll say for now. And I'll let you tell your story. And then I think it'll start to become obvious how we landed on creating this podcast.
Sure. And I just want to say, I remember the first time you told me that story of going to that and moving to the altar, and just how powerful it was. And
Mm.
it still gave me goosebumps listening to it again. So that was powerful to hear. I think grief is not something we necessarily like invite into our lives, right? Like it's part of everyone's lives. But in May of 2020, so, when we were in the height of lockdown of COVID, my father was in the hospital, and it was not COVID related in the sense that like he wasn't in the hospital being intubated with COVID. But I'm sure you all remember hospitals were canceling, like non-emergency surgeries and things like that. And my dad had been in remission from cancer and had been waiting to get his port taken out, which is like, I don't know, this like plug they put in you where they can easily access your bloodstream without basically having to put IVs in every week when they are doing chemotherapy. So he had been cleared from cancer for some time and had really wanted this thing taken out. And he was supposed to go in to take it out in March. And they canceled it because it was right around when we all got shut down here in Colorado. Other places had been shut down for longer. And it ended up getting infected. And so he ended up in the hospital with sepsis. And the day before he was supposed to come home, right? Like we all thought like, oh shit, we made it through everything. He really super suddenly passed away. And it was, like with anybody experiencing like the sudden loss of somebody who means so much to you, and like that moment where you just realize, I don't even know if you realize, like I couldn't believe it. My sister called me, and I'll never forget, my husband and I were like in the middle of this ridiculous fight. Like I couldn't even tell you what. It was probably like you didn't wash a dish or something, like just totally ridiculous. And my sister had called several times, and I finally answered because I was like, what does she want? And she told me, and I just kept screaming at her, shut up, shut up, shut up. I just wanted her to stop talking. I just didn't want what she was saying to be real. And my husband came right over and embraced me. And I don't even know. It was just like so many things were happening. Like I was in disbelief, and I was angry, and I was fucking broken and devastated. And I was just flooded. And all of a sudden, there was no hiding how overwhelmed with emotion I was. I was literally, it was like I'm very dramatic anyway, but it was like, dramatic, like falling on the ground, crying. Like I would be walking and suddenly like the earth would just give beneath me, and I'd just fall down and just cry and lay on the floor. And everything around me reminded me of him. We were in the mountains where, my husband and I had been lucky enough to find this beautiful place in the mountains. And part of why we got it was because my dad loved being in the mountains and loved to fish. And so, there was like this picture of him and his room where him and my mom would sleep when they would come up. And I couldn't hide it. And so I made kind of a conscious choice, and my body didn't give me a choice to mourn very publicly, So I have two little boys who are 5.5, twin boys. And so they were 2.5 at the time. And I would just cry in front of them. One, I couldn't help it. And two, I wanted them to know, like, if I was acting weird as their mommy, it was because I was really, really sad. And the other thing that it did was, one of the reasons I was so sad, no one's perfect, but my dad was a very wonderful, like the best dad I could have ever picked out of the universe. And he was an even more doting, loving grandfather. And my little boys had only had him for 2.5 years. And I felt so sad that they wouldn't get to know him in the way that my nieces and nephews got to know him, and that he wouldn't know these little beings. So I decided I was going to talk about him all the time and that they would know him through me and that he would know them through me. And so we talk about him all the time. And there were just these beautiful things. I would text Rebecca, like, we'd be driving by a lake and my little boys would say like, abuelo's down there
Mhm.
fishing, abuelo's grandpa in Spanish. And, I have no idea. I'm sure at some point in the podcast we'll get to something about
Right.
like, what happens? Where do people go? What is the afterlife? Are there spirits? Like, can we connect with them? I'm sure it'll be something that we explore, but I don't know what it was that they were experiencing, particularly in those first 2 years after he passed, where they saw him, they
Mm.
had like a daily interaction of some kind with him, and it brought me so much peace. And I think the other thing that it did, so one, like the grief opened me up to like emotionally in a way that like my family and I just didn't operate like that. Like we loved each other, but I don't know, we weren't going
Mhm.
to like sit around and cry together. Like that was not us. And I think with me and my grief, there was no escaping it. Like I was like, I'll be in
Mhm.
my room all the time. I'm sad all the time. So I can't lock myself away. So they're just going to have to learn, that mommy gets sad and I can be happy and I can be all these things. So it helped me do that. And the other thing that it helped me do was, I think for so many people, COVID was this moment of awakening. And so COVID plus my dad passing was this moment of like, what am I doing in my life? Where am I finding my joy? My dad's family, his mom and dad both died in their 90s. So my dad passing at 70
Yeah.
wasn't 50, but also was like, for me, even though I know none of us is guaranteed the next minute, I felt so robbed of 20 years. But it was also this just like wake up call of like, Andrea, you have no idea how long you're going to live. And like, do you want to spend it achieving shit, or do you want to spend it like taking care of yourself and the people that you love? And I made these huge shifts in my life to take care of myself and the people that I love. And I feel like my demonstration of my love for my dad is like, I really feel like I'm living my most complete and fulfilled life. I'm so dedicated to my little boys. I love my husband. I love cultivating like friends who I just fucking love being around. I love talking to, you and I'm like, thank God restaurants close, or we would be talking until one
It's so
o'clock in the
real.
morning. And I love that. And I want to cultivate more of that, because we all have heard that adage, right? Like, oh, at the end of your days, you don't think about how well you did at that meeting, or the only people who are going to remember how much you
Mm-mm.
worked are your kids. Like, I don't want to reflect on that on my fucking deathbed, Like, I want to reflect on that now and change now and prioritize now, not wish I had prioritized.
Mhm.
So that's been my journey. And so, while I would give anything to have my dad here, I'm also so grateful for what
Yes.
grief has taught me, not his death, for what grief. I'm not there yet, but
Totally. I
what
think
grief
that's
has
such
taught
an
me.
important distinction too, because I think a lot of times, and I know I came up against this in my training with grief yoga, and they have a very specific structure. There would be these topics like gratitude in your grief, or like what I've learned, what my grief has taught me. I mean, I think it's just such a common experience to me. I'd actually prefer to have not learned a fucking thing and have the person I love still be here, right? When it's a loss that is of someone you love and you enjoyed being alive and human and talking. I had a conversation with my mom where I was like, oh, I'm going to miss you when you're gone. And she's like, oh, I'll never be gone. I'll still be there. I'm like, no, but you like physically won't be here and I won't be able to have conversations with you. And she's like, no, you can still talk to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're not getting what I'm throwing down. Cool. Glad you're okay with leaving. I'm letting you know I'll miss you, but there
Right,
is,
right.
you mentioned the word awakening. I think there's something that happens. I think we live in a way that's not congruent with the fact that we're mortal. And so when we're struck with the mortality of ourselves, whether that's a terminal diagnosis
Right.
or a grief of our own life ending, or someone we love, something we're with them for a long time, or it's sudden, we just wake up to what's actually happening and what life actually is. We don't get to be here forever, and we don't get to keep the people here forever, and we don't even get to dictate, oh, everyone was 90 in this family, so like my dad will live tonight. We expect it, but then we suddenly wake up to like, oh, that wasn't even a promise.
Right.
Shit just happens, harm happens, things happen in an instant. And it is like this kind
Right.
of this awakening that's bittersweet, because it's like I'd rather be asleep and have the person I love and not wake up to that reality. But you wake up to it and it clarifies everything. It can. I mean, I don't want to speak for everyone, but it can
Yeah.
really it feels often that that's what I encounter, that somewhere in someone's grief, there's something where they wake up to this idea of like, what even is important? What are we even doing here? What am I doing here? And that definitely speaks to what
Yeah.
our connection was. I mean, I think you've always been a feeler, and you've always, like, you call it dramatic. I call it just being like a feeler and sensitive and real and having depth. And that was our connection when we first met. So of course it was always safe for me to talk about all the things. I have some friend groups where even saying I'm working with grief now, they like glaze over, they lean back. And it's like, I
Right.
just said I work with grief. I didn't say I'm currently in the most acute grief and you have to hold me. I just said like I'm working with grief and you're afraid of me, like it's contagious. And guess what? You're going to feel grief in your lifetime if you haven't, and you probably have, and you just aren't letting yourself. But that's the reality. But then I have the people who are like, yes, can we talk about that? And so you are always that person. But I think that when you really have that experience of grief, I mean, when I lost my dad, it's crazy. I remember parts of your story because I had cancer and I had a port and I had to have it removed. So I remember that and just how devastating something so
Yeah.
simple and routine going so horrifically wrong. There's no reason you should have expected that. But I didn't remember that you and your husband were having a fight because I was having a fight with my husband at the time. I remember we were in the kitchen and we were arguing about something
Oh
and the
my
phone was
gosh.
ringing and it was late at night. And I thought, who the fuck is calling me this late? Right? Like, this better be important. And I went upstairs
Same.
and because my phone was upstairs and I picked up the phone and it was my brother. So your sister, right? So this was my brother. And he said, Dad's dead. I was like, wow, of all the ways
Yep.
he could have delivered that, it was just so direct. And it was a heart attack. So, I mean, it wasn't
Right.
like that we had been thinking about it or he was in the hospital or anything.
Mm.
And I don't remember
Yeah.
what I said to him, but that place where it feels so unreal. And there's some part of me that was bargaining, like, oh, you're just saying that. That's not quite what you mean. Or he might be, but he could come right back to life. Like, it was like all these things kind of happening in me that was like, that's not what's actually happening. And I quickly got off the phone with him. And I remember I walked down the stairs and I thought
Right.
that what I said was, my dad died, just like that. But what my husband said was, whatever you said was unintelligible, but I knew someone
Yeah.
had died because he lost his dad when he was 14, when he knew
Oh,
grief and he knew that was the sound coming out of me. And he didn't know who died, but yeah, he just held me in that moment. But so
oh,
interesting, those parallels in our story, right? Like, I was like, what the hell were we even fighting? Right. And it
yeah.
was like in the kitchen. So probably
That
about the
is.
dishes. It was probably, it's
Yes.
just like, and it was so unimportant. I don't even
Yeah.
remember
Yeah.
what was happening in that moment before because that next moment was so pivotal. And I didn't, we differ in the relationship piece. I wasn't close to my dad at that point in
Yes.
my life, but it was sort of like the 8-year-old me that used to be really close to her dad finally got to grieve how that relationship had
Mm,
dissolved and also
mm,
felt like, oh, now I see the shortness of his life. And I feel so sad that I was holding tight to my position and he was holding tight to his, and we couldn't
yeah.
find our way to love before he left. Yeah.
Oh, oh, yeah. I feel that in my heart. And I think that that is so interesting, like the argument piece, because when I think back to that moment, right, where it's like the world before my dad passed away, shit, like it was your turn to do the dishes or whatever that fight was so important in that moment. We weren't sitting on the same couch. We were like facing each other across the room. We were not on the same team. We were holding our positions about this thing that in one instant, it was like, fuck, none of that. I mean, the moment Bryce understood what happened, he was next to me and holding me. There was no more of whatever that animosity. I'm sure this happened to your husband. Like whatever that animosity was that was holding him in his position on his side of the kitchen, like was gone. And I hold on to that moment because sometimes we still have our arguments about whatever. And I'm like, it's so morbid. But like sometimes I'll just think, Andrea, what if he dies? Like, is this the moment you want? What if, like, remember, like, your world can change in an instant. Wrap this shit up, get this argument over, because ultimately, like, through experience, this doesn't
Mhm.
really matter. Like, it matters in a moment, but it can also not matter in a moment. And I sometimes am able to do it, and sometimes I'm like, but he probably won't die, and I probably won't die, so I'm
Yeah.
going to
And I
still
want
do
to
that.
add something to that because I think that's ideal, right? That it's remembering we're immortal, remembering what's actually important. And that, yeah, I think in that moment, it wasn't like, I mean, I can still feel the tension that was in the room in that fight, right? That I was mad that someone called and interrupted. But it wasn't like I thought, okay, yeah, let me cry for a minute and then we need to get back to that, right? Like it just went away. And I'm sure we never
Right,
resolved it and we never revisited it. It's that sense of it might have felt really important and it
right.
also wasn't. But I'll say the last conversation I had with my dad was unpleasant. And it was like just that feeling of tension and friction, and just this way that, I mean, how I would describe our relationship is he was very, I mean, he reminded me a lot of the character Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh, right? It was like, oh, I'm sad and like fix it. And I was just tired of feeling responsible for that. And so we were supposed to visit my sister. She was graduating from her art college in Chicago, and we were all going to go on this trip. We were having a conversation, but he was like, "Oh, I can't possibly take the L from the airport," and he wanted me to pick up because we were driving, and he wanted me to pick him up, and I was like, "No, you're a
Mhm.
grown man. You're capable. The L is manageable. Like, you can do this. I believe in you." And so I was just so agitated because this was this whole way that he just was like, I can't do things, and I'm incompetent. And I was like, no, I believe in you. You got this. And was like, sort of like, look, my sister, your youngest child, has completely figured out the L system. If she can do it, you can do it. She can't change her windshield wipers, but she can figure out the L. So like, you got this, but it wasn't like a really loving conversation. It was just like this eye rolly, like, yeah, no, we're not picking up. I'm not sitting in Chicago traffic. I'm not doing that. You can take the L. Call my sister. She'll help you figure it out. She'll tell you exactly what to do. It's very straightforward. You'll be fine. And so I just got off the phone and I thought, God, it was just not a pleasant conversation. And then there was one opportunity that I could have talked to him, but it was Thanksgiving. My brother and I were talking and I could hear him in the background, and I still was holding on to that agitation. And I was like, oh, I don't need to say
Mhm.
happy
Mhm.
Thanksgiving. I don't need to talk to him. And then he died a few days later. In the grief and in talking to my brother, I was like, I feel so heavy that the last time I talked to him, I was just annoyed with him and short with him. And then I had an opportunity to even talk to him a few days later, and I didn't, like just a few days before he passed. And my
Mhm.
brother so sweetly and compassionately offered me, he said, no one conversation is any more significant than any other conversation. Your last conversation is not the
Oh,
most important conversation you had with him. And it just like, it's like, thank you. So I kind of also hold on to that when I decide to be really mad at someone. And then I think, oh, what if you die? And then I think, well,
mm.
it's not, this conversation isn't more significant. We've had some loving ones. I'm going to have this fight. So like let yourself off the hook. For sometimes there are fights you like, yeah, that you
I
just
love
have
that.
to have. And that way that you're saying where it's like, well, and maybe you're probably not going to die today. So I'm going to go ahead and have this fight. Right. But I do always want the people in my life to know that they are loved, and that certainly if we're having a
Yes.
fight and that was our last conversation, don't hold on to that. I loved you
Yeah.
and I loved fighting with you because that's part of being alive and human. It isn't fighting just great when you know
Totally.
you're right and that other person is so wrong. It's fun, but it's like bringing in, I think sometimes even just like permission to not get living right because,
Yeah. That's so helpful. And one of the things that, like, in dark moments or when I'm feeling just like pity for myself, I will think about, like, God, sometimes my dad annoyed me. He was so overprotective. He was like, whatever the opposite of a risk taker was, that was
oh,
him.
so we're
Like, he was
kindred
like,
spirits. I love him for that.
yes, yes. Like, his most popular saying, which after having kids I have stolen, was like, "That's the speed limit, not the speed minimum." Like, I mean, And so I would totally get annoyed. I am not like, I would laugh that I'm like, this is what happens when two, I don't know how to describe them. They wanted to raise a smart, independent woman. And then they did. And they were like, fuck, why do you want to do everything
Right.
you want to do your way? And they're like, oh shit, this is exactly what we wanted. So I was constantly pushing on my dad's
Oh,
like terror
true.
button, and it would get annoying. I'd be like, Dad, everything's going to be fine. Dad, don't worry. And I would the eye roll conversation, and I would get, annoyed or frustrated with like how protective he could be, and sometimes like those scenes will play in my head and I really have to shake them off. I have to be like, Andrea, like he was your dad. You're supposed to have like some degree of
Mhm.
conflict with your dad. Like, the people that I love the most, like I bore my children and some days they annoy the shit out of me, like it is part of the human experience and it is like the complete picture of our relationship. And we would get frustrated with each other, but like the heart of our relationship was like deep admiration and like love. And so, yeah, those scenes will play in my head every once in a while. And I really have to shake them off and be like, yep, you talked to him like that. And yep, he still knew that you loved him and
Yeah.
he still loved you. So that's a helpful perspective. I
Yeah,
appreciate
it's so
it so
sweet to
much.
just hear that. And I think it's important to just offer that to people, like that it is the full experience. And I can almost imagine, I mean, I always sort of just imagine it as myself, at some point, yeah, we'll explore the realm of what do you think happens. But if I imagine that we still have some awareness, or like my mom says, oh, I'll still be there, like this awareness, and we're in this
Yeah.
spirit realm that we look at the fullness of a life, and it's like, oh, that's so what it was to be human, that we were feelers, and we rub up against each other, and we agitate each other, and because we love each other, we're like, we don't even realize we're maybe fighting for the same thing, which is connection and understanding each other. Like your dad getting to understand, I'm an independent woman. This is why I'm doing this. And him wanting you to understand life is dangerous and I want you to, make it
Right.
through. But like we're fighting for the same thing, to be understood and to deepen our connection, so often. And like, I don't know, I can just imagine if I was in a realm looking down at human life, I'd be like, oh, it was so great when we fought. Wasn't that hilarious that we thought that was like the most important thing? Like I can imagine that for myself and just sort of how I would look at life. But kind of, I think that that's part of grief, is working through regret, working through
Yeah.
like, oh, there was so much that was so great. And then these moments that were like, ugh, and I was cringy and I wasn't being loving, things
Yeah.
I might have been holding on to with my dad. And I mean, one of the things I know for me that was really a big break in our relationship was when my parents divorced. Our relationship shifted so dramatically then, and it wasn't because of me, because I was only 8. I just thought, cool, I'll have 2 houses. And I mean, at that point, my dad thought I hung the moon, and I've thought that of him. And it was like we were thick as thieves. And then they divorced. And then my dad didn't know how to be a single dad, and he didn't know how to show up. And it was a pretty dramatic shift in our relationship. And I think, so much in those years, and him remarrying and having a stepmother who was awful to me and not feeling him protecting me, like there were so many breaks in our relationship. So even just in grief, having to recognize that it just wasn't going to be useful. I mean, I was never going to get him to have that conversation where I could say, what happened? Like where I had the
Yeah.
capacity for understanding and forgiveness, but we just never got to have that conversation. And that was a
Mm.
loss, and that there was a certain grief of, oh, we didn't get to be real about how we lost each other in my childhood, or how there was like an abandonment of sorts. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, there's like all of that comes in the grief. What we
Yeah.
miss, what
Yeah.
didn't get to happen, just all of it.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. And so that's how we got here. Was through conversations like this. And I think like I've learned so much from you in your practice and in your approach to your own grief and navigating like the complexities of it, and your ability to just like, be able to support me. I remember it wasn't that long after my dad passed away. I think it was that summer that I came over and sat in your living room and just fucking cried and talked and cried and ate. And, and I, then you start to see the world differently. And I think other people that I've talked to who have experienced like that fracturing grief, grief, right? Like that grief that like makes you a different person. Because I had loss before. I had lost 3 grandparents of my 4. I had lost a friend to murder. Like I had, like shocking and not shocking. But this was the one where I was like, I was one person, the day before, and I was another person the moment after that call or the moment on that call, and have been becoming a new person ever since. And so kind of seeing like all these different ways that grief appears and manifests, and all these different ways that people move through it, and things that we are drawn to help us come to terms and interpret and be in our grief they've just been everywhere and so profound. And yet it's this conversation that doesn't happen, like it's really rare, especially in the first year after my dad died, that people would ask me about him or about my heart,
Mhm.
like it was this year of like, how are you doing? I'm fine. And that creepy smile,
Mhm.
because I was like, when I actually tell you how I am, yeah, they do the lean back, like, oh shit, I just meant like, I hope you're okay, but I can't deal with it if you're not. So it was like, how do we connect with one another, whether we're feeling or whether that lens has been put over our eyes and we're seeing the world in a different way? Because we're all experiencing grief in some way. That's what
Mhm.
I learned was, oh man, we are experiencing grief all the time and we just don't want
Yeah,
to
and we don't
talk
have
about it.
space to. I mean, we've constructed a world that really does struggle to like actually mean the question, how are you? We don't have time for you to say anything other than I'm fine or I'm okay. But I think about that when I talk to people, I do actually mean tell me everything. I'm like, God, what are the better questions? I mean, to say to someone who is in grief, how's your grief today? And to really mean like
Mm.
I'm inviting you to talk about your grief, or where's your heart today, or something that's a little bit more than just the casual like how are you. I'm like, I don't know what you mean when you ask that, because some people mean I really want to know, so you might not know when I ask that what I mean. I want you to know you can be however you are, and that feels
Yeah.
important to me. And I think, like you're saying, I think everyone has grief, even if you haven't experienced a grief loss. And I think that when we
Yeah.
don't understand that, we end up in these sort of maladaptive places. So a lot of things like anxiety are actually related to grief, where it's like, oh, you're so scared of something going wrong because you recognize that we're mortal, and there's a grief to be had in that. But instead of grief, we keep trying to control. It's like, keep it safe, in which is, I'm only sharing because I know this well. Like, I know in my bones
Yeah.
that like fear of things going wrong. So the idea would be joining like this to just offer a space to be having these conversations and starting to just, I mean, and it's not that there aren't grief podcasts out there. We know them, we follow them, we love them, but to just
Yep.
have more of them, because I think it's sort of like we can't have enough messages of the things that our culture is afraid of allowing. We can't have enough conversations to say, please, it's okay to feel your grief. Yeah, to
Yeah.
make it safe. Yeah.
Yeah. You're right. And to counterbalance the incredible weight of like, that is something private.
Mhm.
That is something that has the kind of like limit to it, right? Like I was just on a walk with my husband yesterday and I was telling him like, we're going to record our first podcast. Very excited. And I was like, that question about like, how are you, and how it's become our window dressing of
Mhm.
conversation, right? And it confuses. I'm friends with a lot of folks who are not from the United States. And they're like, I was so
Mhm.
confused by that question because I would answer people and then they would look at you and you could tell they were like, oh shit, I really just wanted, I'm okay.
Right.
Like that's about as deep as it can go. Yeah. And that question that you posed about the heart, my husband, who's a therapist, would ask me when we first started dating, how is your heart? And I was like, what is that question? I would get nervous because I was like, oh my God, he's going to ask me how my heart is today. I was like, I got to go get one of those little emotional chart things because I'm like happy, sad, mad, glad. I don't know. I
It's hilarious. It's making me think of, is it Monty Python, the Holy Grail, where it's like, what's your favorite color? Blue. No, red. And it's like you got the answer wrong, and it's your heart.
right, right. But I would get so
Right.
nervous. Yes. And he probably only knew the colors of the rainbow.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh. And so now it's like it took me so long to like come into
Mhm.
practice of like him asking me that question and like He wasn't expecting, like, if I would have said red, he would have been like, no, your favorite color's green. It's like whatever my heart was feeling was what my heart was feeling. But I was so disconnected from people checking
Mhm.
in on my heart. And it was just such a jarring thing. And so I think when I am connected to people now who understand the longevity of grief and how, like, some days I smile about it, and like just last night I was crying with people about it because they also had happened to have parents who had passed away in much
Mhm.
the same way during COVID. And then there's some people who just really don't understand and really think I should be over it, 3 years on. And so, it's just an opportunity, I think, for us just to invite all the different ways that people grieve and we grieve. And you and I have talked about that as we've been talking about episode topics. There are some parts of it that we share, I think,
Mhm.
that like, that sinking feeling, that disbelief, that sort of like desire and longing for it, just like, please let this be not what's happening in my life right now.
Yeah.
And yet then there are other things that just, are so different, and just allowing people to grieve in the way that like serves them and moves them,
Mhm.
keeps them
Right.
moving.
Totally. And that feels like an important piece to like underline, highlight, put in bold, like that there's something also really important and to share about both of our hearts around the experience of grief. And I think that's come up in so many of our conversations. It's so individual and it's so unique. So while you in your grief thought, okay, I'm going to reach out to the people I know who've experienced loss, and you reached out to me, and it's like my loss was different, even though it was also my father. It was so different in the experience of it. And so for me not to say, oh, I know what you're going through. Like, I
Mm,
don't know what you're going through. And I know this is grief. I mean, even like with my husband just being like, I didn't know who died, but I knew that was grief.
right.
And so there's something where you have this, I see you, I hear you, but you also, I don't know that I know, and I can't know because I'm not in your body and I
Yeah.
can't. And I think that was some of the most impactful conversations that I had where people were like, I can't even know what this is like for you, like what you're experiencing, even if they experienced loss, and where they might say things like, I wish right now I could suffer this for you and I could just take the pain away
Hmm.
from you. And I was like, thank you. And you know that you can't, and you're not trying to pretend you know what I need. And
Yeah.
then the people who would come in and be like, well, what you need to do? And I was like, yeah, please get away. And so just to share that our heart is, we're going to be sharing like pieces of what our experiences were, philosophizing about like the experiences of grief, and not just grief through loss, which has sort of been mostly the focus of what our connection was, but that there are so many griefs in life that can happen that aren't related to death. And we'll be diving in even into those, but this human experience of grief, so multifaceted. And so ever, if we sound prescriptive or like we know, and this is what grief is, that is not our intention. And we will try to catch ourselves. That it's just to have space to say, like, it is an inescapable part of the journey of being human.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think sometimes, like, one of the ways that I think about, like, recognizing the grief in someone else, yeah, like, I don't know exactly what you said. I don't know how somebody experienced the grief, but I can recognize it in them. And I think about this scene in Harry Potter. So there's two things you're probably going to hear me talk about: Foo Fighters and Harry Potter. So just as a warning to future listeners, I know I talk about them a lot.
I love it.
They both have some sort of connection with me and actually my grief journey. But right now, I'm going to talk about Harry Potter and the shift that I had, and I think lots of people have when they go from not having experienced profound grief to having experienced profound grief. So there is this scene in Harry Potter, and I can't remember which movie, where he shows up at school and there are these giant kind of bat-like skeleton horse creatures that are pulling their carriage that is taking them up to school, and he had never seen them before, and so he's just kind of like shocked and in awe. And this other character, her name's Luna Lovegood, walks up to him and is like, oh, you can see them too now. And he's like, can't everyone? She says, no, that only people who have experienced death something really traumatic in front of them are able to see them. And so when I think about being on the other side of grief, I kind of think of that. I think about suddenly being in this world where you can see things, connections between people, you can see the sorrow lines on people's faces. Like suddenly you can see things with a different perspective. And so I think about that scene in Harry Potter with the Thestrals.
I think it's that thing of the lean away versus leaning in, and that way that when people know grief, then they become less afraid to lean in. It can be really comforting to have. And I know, I mean, the woman who started Grief Support Network talks about that, where she was, her first experience of loss. She lost her firstborn, I think a few months after he was born. And she had such a great community of really loving people who cared about her, but she just didn't realize the difference. She and her husband were like, we've got to travel, we've got to get away. They went to, I think, Bali. And when they were there, she said, I mean, there even was a language barrier, but people could tell we were in grief and they were leaning towards us instead of leaning away, which was what she was feeling in the States. And so I think, other cultures just have a way that people hold grief. And my wish and my desire is, can we start to do that here? Like, we got away from some humanity in the developing of this country, and like, can we come back to learning how to lean in and not have to have experienced grief to understand how to lean in, but to just lean in and lean towards grief. And I think part of that is going back to something you said around, having more voices and having more, just, we're so heavy in the lean away part of our culture, in the growth only and happiness only and like good vibes only, literally, is a saying that we both hate. And so there's so much leaning in that direction. And it's like, okay, so let's start to offer more and more. And I would always say, when I worked with eating disorders and, body image stuff would come up, and I'm like, we are in a culture that is it's ubiquitous. Everything is, be on a diet, be thin, this, whatever, that you have to heavily weight your life in the direction of understanding body positive messaging, finding every Facebook feed about body positivity to really get out of that trance. And so the idea we had was to end each episode with just like a way that we're connecting with grief, because we do read the books and listen to the podcast and find all the things. And so there's some way that we are touching in with sort of honoring grief regularly. Yeah, to sort of close today with checking in on how's your heart touching into grief this week?
Yeah. So as I mentioned just a little while ago, so you'll hear me talk about the Foo Fighters a lot. So they're my favorite band since I was, I don't even know, 17, 18? And last March, their drummer, Taylor Hawkins, passed away at 50, super surprisingly, on tour in a hotel room in Bogota, Colombia. And, just total shock. It's like one of those bands that's, had already been around for 25 years. You're like, yeah, we're going to get 25 more. And, for those of you who don't know much or anything about the band, Dave Grohl, who's the front man of the Foo Fighters, was the drummer of Nirvana. Well, one of the drummers, but the last drummer of Nirvana. So he was part of the band when Kurt Cobain took his life. And part of how Dave dealt with that grief was by creating this band, the Foo Fighters, with Pat Smear, who was also in Nirvana, and other folks who had experienced like loss, like kind of like the fun and excitement and dream of being in a rock and roll band being cut too short, and like that moment of like, all we get to do is live. And so they created this band to celebrate life and like live every moment. And so if you did know the Foo Fighters, like Dave and Taylor had this like really vocal bromance. Like they would say they loved each other. They called each other their life partners, their soulmates, like just this beautiful friendship and brotherhood. And so it was like this devastating loss, like shocking for the fans, for the rock and roll world, everybody. And their new album drops today that we're recording, which is Friday, June 2nd. And they've been releasing different songs. And the last one is this song. It's a 10-minute opus called The Teacher. So Taylor died in March, and then Dave Grohl's mother, who she was a single mom, had raised him, and his sister passed away that summer. And it's this song kind of dedicated to his grief and his mom. And there's this just like really compelling documentary, I don't even know, art style video that goes with it. And it's like seeing your depression and your grief on screen and like hearing these words of like coming through in the song, coming through to a place of acceptance and the willingness and ability to say goodbye to like this person that he adored. And so it's been a really powerful piece. So I'm kind of like emotionally gearing myself up to listen to the whole album. But I've been listening to that song on repeat the last couple days. How about you?
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, for me this week, my good friend Andrea Gibson, they were on the podcast We Can Do Hard Things with Glennon Doyle and Abby Wambach.
Yeah.
And it was powerful. It was amazing. And it really, I mean, I think so many of the themes that we were talking about here in this intro show up in that podcast. There was a moment where Glennon says, how are we not talking about this all the time? You know, just like the truth of life and mortality and all the things. And I was just like, yes. And that just keeps me connected to the commitment around, while there are a lot of people who don't want to talk about this all the time, there are so many who do and who really are craving just that genuine connection about our mortality and life. And so it just keeps me in that space of just honoring that we have grief and that we long for spaces to talk about it.
Beautiful. Well, if you are listening and want to share anything that's connecting your heart with your grief, we welcome you to share it. And we'll provide you with links to both Andrea's interview with Glennon and Abby and the Foo Fighters video if you want to watch that too.
Right. And next week, our next episode will be about our grief bereft culture, which feels just perfect to come after this episode.
All right. So I will see you until then. Rebecca, I love you. I hold you in my heart all the time.
Love you.
Bye, folks.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of All the Grief. You can find us on Instagram at All the Grief Pod. And please take a moment to rate our podcast and share us with your friends. We'd love to keep expanding our reach to all the people who could benefit from conversations on grief. Take care.